In the 1970s, Chicago was a city divided by violence, poverty, and mistrust. On the south side, police patrols rolled through streets where every corner seemed to hold a story of desperation. And in the middle of it all was a man who was supposed to stand for justice, John Burge, a decorated Vietnam veteran who joined the Chicago Police Department with a record that inspired confidence and authority. He had served his country, earned medals, and now wore the badge with pride. To the public, he was a hero. To his fellow officers, he was a man who got results when no one else could. But what the people of Chicago didn't see was the shadow growing behind that reputation. Inside the interrogation rooms of Area 2, Burge developed a system that would haunt the city for decades. Suspects, mostly young black men, were brought in for questioning and came out with bruises, burns, and broken bones. They confessed to murders, robberies, and crimes they later swore they hadn't committed. Their confessions sounded perfect on paper, but their faces told another story. Some said Burge used electrical shock devices. Others said they were suffocated with plastic bags, beaten with flashlights, and threatened with guns. The department didn't ask questions. Burge got confessions that closed cases, and the city celebrated him for cleaning up the streets. Promotions followed, and his so-called midnight crew, a group of officers trained under him, learned that in Chicago, results mattered more than truth. The numbers looked good. The headlines praised the department. And behind the doors of Area 2, justice was dying one confession at a time. It might have continued forever if not for one man. In 1982, a suspect named Andrew Wilson was arrested for killing 2 police officers. It was a high-profile case, and the city wanted answers fast. Wilson confessed after hours of interrogation under Burge's watch. But when he appeared in court, his body was covered in burns and bruises. Doctors documented his injuries. Wilson claimed Burge had tortured him with electric shocks from a generator, suffocated him, and beaten him until he signed a confession just to make it stop. The claim was outrageous, a criminal accusing a decorated officer. Most dismissed it, but a small group of journalists and civil rights attorneys didn't. Over the next decade, they dug into the cases connected to Burge. What they found was staggering. Dozens of men told the same story, the same room, the same methods, the same officers. It wasn't a few bad interrogations. It was a system built on violence and fear. Still, the city resisted. Internal affairs ignored complaints. The state's attorney's office defended convictions. Every institution meant to protect the innocent had closed ranks around the guilty. By the early 1990s, the evidence was undeniable. Activists marched. Newspapers published testimonies. Burge's name became synonymous with corruption. Finally, in 1993, the department could no longer shield him. He was fired. But even then, no one was charged with torture. For years afterward, victims remained in prison, their confessions the only evidence keeping them there. Time passed. Burge retired to Florida, living quietly, drawing his police pension. But the survivors of his torture never stopped fighting. In 2008, federal prosecutors found a way to bring him back into court, not for torture, but for perjury. He had lied under oath in civil proceedings when he denied the abuse. That lie was finally his undoing. In 2010, John Burge was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. The damage, though, could not be undone. More than 100 people had been tortured under his command. Many spent decades in prison. Some died there. In 2015, Chicago officially apologized and established a reparations fund for the victims, the first city in America to ever do so. But the apology felt hollow to those who had lost their lives, their families, and their faith in the justice system. Burge served his time and died in 2018. To some, his death closed a chapter. To others, it reopened old wounds. The city that had once celebrated him was left to reckon with the truth that for nearly 2 decades, its police department had harbored a man who turned interrogation into torture and justice into performance. It left a question that still lingers whenever a police light flickers against a dark Chicago alley. How many more names were buried under the weight of those false confessions, and how many still sit behind bars because the system cared more about convictions than about the truth? In the late 1990s, Los Angeles was a city wearing scars it didn't want to talk about. The Rodney King beating, the riots, the constant tension between police and the people, all of it had left the city raw. Inside the LAPD, the mission was clear: rebuild the image of the department and take back control of the streets. The department's pride was its anti-gang unit. Crash, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, a name that sounded like protection but hid something much darker. The crash officers of the Rampart Division were the elite. They knew the gangs, the drugs, the alleys. They lived by their own code, loyalty to each other first, to the department second, and to the law only when convenient. One of them, Officer Rafael Perez, was seen as a rising star. Charismatic, street-smart, and always quick to claim a big bust. He was the kind of cop the department loved. Tough, relentless, efficient. Until one day in 1998, the facade cracked. Perez was caught stealing 8 pounds of cocaine from an evidence locker. It wasn't a small-time mistake. It was a career-ending betrayal. Facing years in prison, Perez did something the LAPD never saw coming. He started talking. His confession became the spark that exposed one of the most widespread police corruption scandals in American history. He told investigators that Rampart officers were framing suspects, planting evidence, lying under oath, stealing drugs and cash, and even shooting unarmed people. They called it creative policing. They said it kept the streets under control. But in truth, it was a system of fear. Innocent men were sent to prison on fabricated charges. One man, Javier Ovando, was shot by officers, paralyzed, and then framed for assaulting them. He spent years behind bars before the truth came out. Perez described how officers would plant a gun on a dead suspect to justify a shooting, or pocket thousands of dollars during drug raids. They covered for each other, falsified reports, and intimidated anyone who questioned them. The streets they were sworn to protect became a playground for their own power. And the department looked the other way because the numbers, arrests, convictions, seizures, all looked good on paper. When the story broke, Los Angeles went silent. More than 70 officers were implicated. Over 100 convictions were overturned. It was chaos in the courts. Defense lawyers revisited old cases. Families who had buried loved ones under false charges demanded answers. The city paid out tens of millions in settlements. The LAPD, already struggling with public trust, was now on life support. Federal authorities stepped in. For the first time, the LAPD came under a federal consent decree, forced to reform its practices, introduce new oversight, and rebuild from within. But those were just policies on paper. The deeper wound was emotional. People who had grown up in Los Angeles began to wonder if any of the officers who claimed to serve them ever truly did. Perez eventually served a reduced sentence and entered witness protection. Many of his former colleagues resigned quietly, their reputations destroyed. A few went to prison. Some simply disappeared into other departments. For the victims of Rampart, justice was uneven. Some walked free. Others never fully recovered from what they endured. What made it worse was how familiar it all felt, how ordinary. Corruption didn't come from a single villain. It came from the system itself, from incentives that valued arrests over truth, loyalty over honesty, image over reality. The Rampart scandal wasn't just about bad cops. It was about a culture that rewarded them. Years later, as Los Angeles continued to change, the memory of Rampart lingered in documentaries, news specials, and whispers between officers who had lived through it. It was a warning written in the city's history. When those with power start believing the rules don't apply to them, justice becomes a story you tell instead of a promise you keep. In the quiet stretches of rural Mississippi during the early 1990s, the sheriff was more than a lawman. He was a symbol of order, of power, and sometimes of fear. In Claiborne County, that man was Sheriff Walter Bolton. To the locals, Bolton was the kind of sheriff people nodded to in church, the man who'd pat your kid on the head at the diner and shake your hand like a promise. He wore the badge like a birthright, the kind of authority that didn't come from a uniform, but from the silence it demanded. Bolton ran his county like a fiefdom. He decided which crimes mattered, who deserved to walk free, and who didn't. But what the people of Claiborne County didn't know was that beneath his reputation for keeping order, he had turned law enforcement into a business, one where guilt and innocence were bought and sold. It started small, a few dollars from a local dealer to make a problem go away. A seized car quietly re-registered in another name. Then it grew. Drug traffickers began paying him protection money. He'd stage public raids for the cameras, arresting low-level users while the real criminals, the ones paying him, kept running their operations untouched. People started noticing strange patterns. Those connected to Bolton never seemed to get caught, and those who crossed him always did. For years, nobody dared to speak. In a county where the sheriff controlled the jail, the courts, and even the gossip, who could you trust? But corruption has a way of breeding resentment, and it was one of Bolton's own deputies who finally broke the silence. The deputy, weary of watching justice rot from the inside, began recording conversations, casual chats in the patrol car, calls at the station, moments when Bolton forgot that power makes people careless. The tapes captured everything. Bolton laughing about cleaning up cash from a drug bust, bragging about framing a local man who refused to pay protection, even negotiating the price of confiscated cocaine. His voice, once the sound of authority, became the evidence that would bring him down. When federal agents arrived in 1995, the town couldn't believe it. The image of Sheriff Bolton being led away in handcuffs was something no one had ever imagined. The investigation uncovered years of extortion, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. Money had flowed through his office like a hidden river, seized property disappearing, evidence altered, and innocent people charged to keep the illusion of order alive. In court, Bolton sat silent as witness after witness described his control over the county like a reign of fear. Business owners, deputies, and even former allies testified about the payoffs and threats. When the tapes played, the courtroom fell quiet. His laughter echoed, the sound of arrogance collapsing under its own weight. He was sentenced to federal prison, and the county that once feared him began to realize how long they'd been living under his shadow. People who had once avoided eye contact with the sheriff's office began to come forward about old cases, homes raided for no reason, property never returned, charges that never made sense. Each story painted a picture of a man who thought the badge was a license to rule, not to serve. In an interview years later, one of the federal agents who worked the case was asked what struck him most about Sheriff Bolton. He said he wasn't afraid, not of the law, not of the system, not of anyone. That's how you know it's gone too far. When a man with a badge forgets he's supposed to answer to something higher than himself. Bolton served his time and returned to a different Mississippi, one that had moved on, at least on the surface. But the damage lingered. Trust in law enforcement eroded. People became quieter when patrol cars passed by, not out of respect, out of memory. Years later, during a small community forum about police reform, someone asked why the people of Claiborne County hadn't spoken up sooner. An old man who had lived through Bolton's years stood up and said softly, "We thought the sheriff was the law. Turns out he was just a man, and that's what scared us the most." When Walter Bolton was asked in a rare prison interview why he did it, he paused before answering. "Because nobody ever told me no," he said. And in that single sentence, he explained what happens when power goes unchecked. Justice becomes just another deal waiting to be made. In 2010, the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was facing a quiet crisis. The headlines spoke of drug busts, of progress, of officers cleaning up the streets, but behind the walls of the Tulsa Police Department, something poisonous was growing. It began, as corruption often does, with small shortcuts, bending the rules to get a conviction, cutting corners to hit arrest quotas. But soon, those shortcuts became a system, and that system began to destroy lives. At the center of it all was Officer Jeff Henderson, a man celebrated by the department and the media as a relentless narcotics detective. He was known for bringing in major drug dealers, working long hours, and keeping the city's crime rate low. But the truth, buried under layers of forged paperwork and fabricated evidence, was that Henderson's success had been built on lies. Henderson and a few trusted colleagues had turned narcotics enforcement into a game of manipulation. They had a confidential informant, a man named Brandon McFadden, who supplied information that would lead to raids and arrests. The problem was, much of that information wasn't real. Together, Henderson and McFadden created false stories about drug deals, planted evidence, and used coerced testimony to justify search warrants. When the doors were kicked in, the cameras rolled, and the department had another victory to show the public. It worked until it didn't. One of their victims, a father of 3 named Larry Barnes, was convicted on drug charges based on one of Henderson's falsified reports. His wife, too, was charged as part of the same case. They both went to prison, leaving their children behind. But Barnes refused to give up. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, journalists, lawyers, judges, claiming he had been framed by the very people sworn to protect him. For years, no one believed him. Then, slowly, his words reached someone who did. Federal prosecutors began to look closely at Henderson's cases. They found inconsistencies, witnesses who didn't exist, evidence that couldn't be verified, and an informant who had a suspiciously cozy relationship with the police. When McFadden himself was caught trafficking drugs, he decided to talk. What he revealed unraveled the entire house of cards. McFadden testified that he and Henderson had faked evidence, framed innocent people, and even stole money and drugs during raids. Their partnership blurred the line between cop and criminal so completely that even their fellow officers struggled to tell them apart. Henderson denied it all, calling McFadden a liar trying to save himself, but the evidence mounted. Case files didn't match police reports. Key witnesses recanted their statements. The federal investigation widened until the truth was undeniable. In 2011, Jeff Henderson was convicted on multiple counts of perjury and civil rights violations. The fallout was devastating. More than 30 people were released from prison, their convictions tossed out because of the corrupt cases built against them. Some had spent years behind bars. Some had lost everything: families, jobs, homes, all because one officer decided that results mattered more than truth. Tulsa's community was shaken. The police department's credibility was gone. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Activists marched with signs that read "Justice for the Innocent" and "Who polices the police?" The federal government stepped in to review the city's entire narcotics program. For the people freed from wrongful convictions, there was no celebration, only exhaustion and bitterness. Many of them spoke about the years stolen from them, the humiliation of being labeled criminals, and the feeling of helplessness when the people in uniform closed ranks against them. Henderson was sentenced to prison, and McFadden, his once loyal informant, received his own punishment for his role in the scandal. But for Tulsa, the damage lingered. Trust once lost doesn't return easily. In neighborhoods where police once patrolled freely, doors began to close. People turned away when officers passed, afraid that speaking to them could mean trouble. The gulf between law enforcement and the community widened into something unbridgeable. Years later, one of the freedmen was asked what forgiveness looked like to him. He said, "I don't think about forgiveness. I think about my kids growing up afraid of police sirens. That's what they took from me." Tulsa tried to rebuild. New chiefs came and went. The department adopted reforms, new training, new oversight. But for those who had lived through the Henderson years, it was a reminder of how fragile justice can be when truth becomes optional. In the end, Henderson's story wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about the system that let him rise, the culture that rewarded his numbers, and the silence that allowed his lies to live for so long. Every conviction he'd secured once made headlines. Every wrongful one became a quiet tragedy buried behind the sound of applause. And for Tulsa, the applause had long since faded, leaving behind the same question every city asks when trust finally collapses. If the law can be faked, what's left to believe in? In the small towns of northeastern Pennsylvania, the judicial system had always been seen as something almost sacred, stern but fair, an invisible hand that kept the chaos of youth and crime in check. But by the late 2000s, the people of Luzerne County began to notice something strange. More and more children were being sent away to juvenile detention centers for the smallest of offenses: truancy, talking back to teachers, stealing a DVD from a store. The sentences were harsh, often immediate, and the judges seemed almost eager to send kids off in handcuffs. Parents left courtrooms in shock, wondering how a teenager with no prior record could be locked away for months over something that barely deserved detention. At the center of it all were two men, Judge Mark Ciavarella and Judge Michael Conahan. Both were respected, influential, and untouchable. Ciavarella had made a name for himself as the face of zero tolerance. He said he was teaching kids accountability, keeping them off the streets. He told parents it was for their children's own good. The community believed him. After all, he was a judge, the symbol of justice itself. But behind the black robes and the stern lectures, there was a darker story unfolding. One of greed, corruption, and betrayal. The scam was almost unbelievable in its simplicity. Conahan, the president judge, had used his influence to shut down the county's public juvenile detention center. In its place, he and Ciavarella supported a new privately owned facility, one that would be run for profit. Every child sent there brought in revenue. And in return, the judges received secret payments from the facility's owners. Millions of dollars disguised as finder's fees, and business deals. The more kids they sent, the more they earned. For years, the system operated in plain sight. Court hearings for juveniles often lasted just a few minutes. Children as young as 12 were marched away without lawyers, without understanding what was happening to them. Some had never even seen the inside of a police station before that day. Parents begged for leniency, but Ciavarella rarely looked up from his bench. He called it tough love. He said it was saving lives. The truth began to surface thanks to one mother, Sandy Fonzo. Her son, a promising young athlete, had been sent to detention for a minor offense. The experience broke him. He came home a different person, angry, withdrawn, and hopeless. Years later, he took his own life. Devastated, Fonzo demanded answers. Her search led her to an attorney who was investigating strange financial records tied to the county's juvenile justice system. Slowly, the pieces came together. In 2008, the FBI stepped in. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. Bank transfers, falsified contracts, secret meetings, all pointing to a kickback scheme that had traded children's futures for profit. When confronted, both judges denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2009, Ciavarella and Conahan were indicted on federal corruption charges. The story exploded nationwide, the kids for cash scandal, as the media called it. The courtroom where Ciavarella once handed down sentences to terrified teenagers was now filled with those same families, watching as he faced justice himself. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts, the crowd erupted in emotion. Some cried, others shouted, and one voice, Sandy Fonzo's, cut through it all. "You ruined my son," she screamed as marshals led the disgraced judge away. In the aftermath, hundreds of juvenile convictions were overturned. Children who had lost months or years of their lives were finally vindicated, though the scars remained. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court vacated nearly every case Ciavarella had handled between 2003 and 2008, over 4,000 in total. The state paid settlements to victims, but no amount of money could undo the damage. Ciavarella was sentenced to 28 years in prison, and Conahan received a similar fate. During sentencing, the judge presiding over their case said, "You two sold your oath. You turned children into commodities." The scandal sent shockwaves through the country, exposing the danger of mixing profit with punishment. It forced states to rethink how juvenile justice should work and how oversight could fail so catastrophically. For the families of Luzerne County, the betrayal was personal. The men they had trusted to deliver fairness had instead delivered their children into cages for cash. Many of those kids grew up struggling with trauma, substance abuse, or lifelong distrust of authority. Their childhoods had been auctioned off under the guise of discipline. Years later, when journalists revisited the case, they found a community still trying to heal. The courthouse had been remodeled, new judges appointed, but the old wounds lingered. In interviews, former detainees described sleepless nights, the echo of cell doors, the way they still hesitated whenever they saw a police car. When asked if he had any remorse, Ciavarella said only, "I never took a kid who didn't deserve to be punished." It was a statement that revealed how deep the rot had gone, how a man could destroy thousands of lives and still believe he was right. For many in Pennsylvania, the Kids for Cash case became more than a story of corruption. It was a reminder that justice is only as strong as the people entrusted with it. And when those people trade morality for money, the system stops protecting the innocent and starts devouring them instead. In the early 2000s, on the south side of Chicago, the same city that had once been haunted by the name John Burge, corruption found new life in the form of another uniform. Sergeant Ronald Watts was known among his fellow officers as a man who got things done. He patrolled the Ida B. Wells housing projects, a neighborhood that had long been ignored by city leaders and over-policed by the department. Drugs were everywhere, trust was nowhere, and Watts was seen as one of the few officers who could control it. But what most people didn't know was that he wasn't fighting crime, he was running it. Watts and his partner, Officer Khalat Muhammad, operated like predators disguised as protectors. Their method was simple. They targeted local dealers and users, demanding regular payments, protection money, as they called it, in exchange for being left alone. Those who paid continued their business without interference. Those who refused were punished. Drugs would suddenly appear in their pockets or cars during searches. Arrest reports would be filled with lies, and fabricated evidence would guarantee a conviction. In neighborhoods where residents were already terrified of both criminals and cops, speaking up meant risking everything. For nearly a decade, Watts built a small empire of fear within his own beat. Residents whispered about him, but no one dared to file complaints. He was, after all, a sergeant, untouchable, protected by the same blue wall that had shielded men like Burge years before. The police department praised his arrest numbers. Prosecutors celebrated his effectiveness. The media even featured him as an example of community policing done right. The truth began to unravel only when two undercover federal agents stumbled into his operation by chance. They were investigating unrelated corruption within the Chicago Housing Authority when they received a tip about officers shaking down drug dealers. It sounded exaggerated until they looked closer. One name kept coming up, Sergeant Watts. The FBI launched a quiet investigation. They placed hidden cameras, tracked cash flow, and listened to whispers in the neighborhood. In 2012, they set a trap. An informant working with federal agents offered Watts a cash bribe, $200, to protect a fake drug deal. Watts took it. When the agents confronted him, the man who had controlled a community for years suddenly found himself powerless. He was arrested, charged with theft and corruption, and sentenced to prison. But that wasn't the end. His arrest opened the floodgates. Dozens of men who had been convicted based on his arrests came forward, claiming they had been framed. At first, the courts dismissed them. Old cases, old evidence, old wounds. But as new details emerged, it became clear that Watts's corruption had poisoned an entire decade of policing. Witnesses testified that Watts had planted drugs, coerced confessions, and manipulated paperwork to keep his operation hidden. His partner confirmed it all, testifying that their shakedowns were routine, a business, not an exception. The fallout was massive. Beginning in 2016, courts began overturning convictions connected to Watts and his crew. One by one, men walked free, some after years behind bars for crimes they never committed. As of today, more than 200 convictions have been vacated, the largest mass exoneration in Chicago's history. The city was forced to pay millions in settlements, but money couldn't repair the damage done to those neighborhoods. Many of the exonerated men described the same experience, getting pulled over for no reason, being searched, and suddenly finding drugs they had never seen before. They had pleaded guilty just to escape longer sentences, knowing that in Chicago's courts, a police officer's word outweighed their own. For years they were branded as felons. Their records destroyed their chances at work, housing, and even family. Watts served his time and was released, but his name became a symbol, not of justice, but of betrayal. For Chicago, it was another reminder that corruption didn't die with the Burge era. It simply evolved. It became quieter, smaller, embedded within the system rather than standing outside of it. Community activists still talk about the Watts years as a wound that never fully healed. Some of the men he framed have spoken publicly, not with anger, but with exhaustion. One said they said we were the problem. Turns out the problem had a badge. In neighborhoods still scarred by poverty and distrust, the sight of a patrol car can still make people freeze. They remember the years when the police didn't protect them. They profited from them. The city now teaches officers about integrity and accountability, trying to rebuild what men like Watts destroyed. But every training manual, every policy, every speech about reform faces the same shadow, the memory of officers who traded justice for power, and the generations of lives left broken in their wake. When asked years later if he ever thought about the people he framed, Watts reportedly told investigators, "It was just part of the job." Those 6 words summed up the quiet horror of his legacy. Not just a man corrupted by greed, but a culture that allowed corruption to feel ordinary. In a quiet corner of New York State, the small town of Mount Vernon prided itself on being a close-knit community, a place where the police were supposed to know your name, not your business. But beneath that illusion of safety, one officer turned his badge into a weapon and his loyalty into something for sale. His name was Detective Christopher Ridley, and at first glance he seemed like the kind of cop every department wanted, confident, connected, and unshakably calm under pressure. Ridley started his career with big ambitions. He was young, ambitious, and eager to rise through the ranks. He spent his days working narcotics cases, dealing with informants, and building a reputation as a man who could handle dangerous situations. But somewhere along the way, ambition twisted into greed. Working undercover meant getting close to the world he was supposed to police. And over time, That world began to feel more rewarding than the one inside the precinct. It started with small favors, a tip to a local dealer about an upcoming raid, a missing bag of cash after an arrest, a seized vehicle that quietly disappeared from the impound lot. Mount Vernon was small enough that no one noticed at first, but Ridley's confidence grew with every success. Soon, he was running a network of informants who weren't just feeding him information, they were feeding him money. Then came the deal that changed everything. Federal investigators, already tracking a local heroin ring, noticed that their targets always seemed to be one step ahead of them. Every raid ended empty-handed, every wiretap went quiet right before key transactions. Someone was leaking information. They traced the leaks back to Mount Vernon, and eventually to Detective Ridley. In 2019, after months of surveillance, the FBI set a trap. They approached one of Ridley's informants with a fake opportunity, a major drug shipment that needed protection from law enforcement. Ridley took the bait. He offered to provide insider information for a cash payment, promising to make sure the shipment got through safely. The payment was recorded. The meeting was documented, and when he walked out of the diner that night, the same hands that had cuffed hundreds of suspects were cuffed themselves. The news broke fast. A respected detective charged with corruption, accused of betraying his badge. The headlines didn't just shock Mount Vernon, they enraged it. For years, citizens had complained of mistreatment, racial profiling, and unexplained police misconduct. Now they had proof that some of their suspicions were justified. During the investigation, prosecutors uncovered a pattern. Ridley had been feeding information to drug dealers for years, warning them about raids, helping them avoid arrest, and even advising them on how to move their operations around police patrols. In exchange, he received thousands of dollars in cash, gifts, and favors. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was a consultant for criminals wearing the uniform of the law. When confronted, Ridley denied everything at first. He claimed he was working off the books, trying to build trust with informants to catch bigger targets. But the FBI had the recordings. They had the cash marked with serial numbers. They had his voice on tape explaining how to evade the next raid. There was no saving him. In 2021, he was convicted of bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. His own department sat in the back, staring at a man who had once been their colleague, now stripped of everything that gave him authority. He was sentenced to several years in federal prison. But the story didn't end with his conviction. The fallout from his corruption spread like cracks through the department. Old cases were re-examined, convictions questioned, evidence reviewed for tampering. It turned out that some of Ridley's arrests were based on information that had been bought rather than earned. The city had to reopen files, call in oversight committees, and face the public's growing anger. Residents of Mount Vernon described a chilling shift in trust. Parents told their children not to speak to the police, no matter what. People stopped calling for help during disputes, fearing the officers might be working both sides. For years, the department had struggled to build credibility. Ridley's betrayal shattered it overnight. What hurt the most for many wasn't just the corruption itself, but how casual it seemed. In recordings, Ridley laughed as he discussed bribes, joked about side money, and referred to his criminal partners as clients. It was the sound of a man who no longer believed in the line between right and wrong, because he had erased it himself. Even after his sentencing, Ridley's case haunted Mount Vernon. Reform measures were passed. Training on ethics was introduced. But the damage couldn't be undone by paperwork. The people who had grown up believing the police were there to protect them now looked at every badge with suspicion. The city's motto, Mount Vernon Strong, began to sound like an empty slogan. Ridley's story became a warning in police academies across the state. Not just about corruption, but about the slow, invisible way it takes hold, the way a single favor turns into a habit into a system. His fall wasn't just a personal failure. It was a reminder of what happens when a department forgets that its greatest weapon isn't force, it's trust. In the end, Mount Vernon rebuilt, at least on the surface. New officers joined, old cases faded from headlines, but among the community, the conversation still returned to the same haunting truth. Corruption doesn't just steal money, it steals belief. And once belief is gone, even justice feels hollow. In a small parish in Louisiana, the badge was supposed to mean protection, but for years, one sheriff's deputy turned it into a tool for control, fear, and personal power. His name was Chad Scott, an agent with the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration who had built a reputation as a relentless narcotics officer. In official reports, he was described as a man who got results. In reality, he was running a criminal enterprise under the DEA's own roof. Scott's career started in the 1990s, and from the beginning, he stood out. He had an arrest record that made headlines and a swagger that intimidated even other agents. He prided himself on being aggressive, unrelenting, and ruthless with drug dealers. But the longer he worked in narcotics, the more he realized something that would twist his morals beyond recognition. The people he arrested were making more money than he ever would. It began quietly. Cash from seizures started to disappear. Evidence logs didn't always match what was actually confiscated. Drug dealers whispered about a DEA agent who could make problems go away for the right price. At first, nobody believed it. The DEA was supposed to be clean, above the kind of street-level corruption that infected local departments. But rumors spread, and inside the agency, whispers turned into suspicions. Scott was known for his flashy style, expensive suits, new cars, and frequent vacations that didn't match his government salary. He explained it away easily enough: family money, good investments, bonuses. His supervisors wanted results, not explanations. And Scott gave them results: big drug busts, glowing media coverage, and public praise for taking down traffickers. But beneath that image, he was manipulating everything. He took bribes from drug dealers in exchange for protection. He planted evidence on suspects he didn't like. He even instructed cooperating witnesses to lie under oath to secure convictions. His entire career had become a balancing act, keeping enough real arrests flowing to satisfy his bosses while maintaining his own underground network for profit. The truth started unraveling when one of his own informants turned on him. A man named Keith Franks, a drug dealer who had been paying Scott for years, was arrested by the FBI in a separate case. In exchange for leniency, Franks began talking. What he described sounded like something out of a crime drama: a federal agent who stole drug money, rigged cases, and took a cut of nearly every bust he oversaw. The FBI didn't want to believe it at first, but as they dug deeper, they found bank deposits, wire transfers, and recorded conversations that supported the claims. When agents confronted one of Scott's former colleagues, the man admitted that Scott had pressured him into falsifying reports, saying it was how the game worked. In 2017, after more than 2 decades in law enforcement, Chad Scott was arrested and charged with multiple counts of perjury, obstruction of justice, and theft of government property. His arrest sent shockwaves through the DEA, not just because of what he had done, but because of how long he had gotten away with it. The trial was ugly. Former informants, agents, and prosecutors took the stand, each revealing a piece of a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture. Scott had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from evidence lockers. He had seized property from suspects and kept it for himself. He had even framed people to cover up his crimes when things got too close. In one case, he planted drugs on a man who had refused to pay him. That man spent years in prison before the truth came out. When the verdict came in 2021, Scott was found guilty on every major count. The judge called his actions a betrayal of every principle of justice. He was sentenced to more than a decade in federal prison. His career, once built on the illusion of authority, ended in disgrace. But what followed was even more damaging. Defense attorneys began combing through years of DEA cases tied to Scott. Convictions began to fall apart. People who had been imprisoned on his word were now demanding reviews, claiming they had been framed or manipulated. Some were released, others filed lawsuits. And the DEA, an agency already under scrutiny for its tactics, faced another public crisis. For the people of Louisiana, the scandal confirmed what many had feared for years: that even at the highest levels, corruption could thrive. Community leaders spoke openly about the trauma Scott had inflicted, not just on individuals, but on trust itself. When a man with a badge lies, one defense lawyer said, truth becomes a victim too. Scott's fellow agents tried to distance themselves. They said he was an outlier, a rogue actor, but documents later revealed that several colleagues had quietly expressed doubts years before his arrest. Doubts that were ignored because his arrest numbers were too good to question. Even now, long after his conviction, his name carries a stain in the halls of Louisiana's law enforcement. Young officers are warned about the Scott syndrome, the temptation to measure success by numbers rather than integrity. His case is cited in ethics training across the DEA, a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked. When reporters asked Scott during his sentencing if he regretted what he'd done, he said nothing. He stared forward, jaw tight, eyes flat. For years he had demanded confessions from others. Now he offered none of his own. In the end, Chad Scott's story became less about one man's greed and more about a system's blindness. A system that rewards results so fiercely it sometimes forgets to ask how those results are achieved. And in that blindness, corruption doesn't just survive, it thrives, wearing the same badge it once promised to defend. In the heart of Baltimore, the police were once called the city's last line of order. But by 2017, that line had dissolved completely. The Gun Trace Task Force, a special elite unit created to get illegal firearms off the streets, had become something far darker, a criminal gang with badges. Led by Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, the task force was supposed to represent the best of the Baltimore Police Department. Instead, it exposed how deeply corruption had infected the institution meant to protect the public. Jenkins was charismatic, energetic, and seemingly fearless. He made headlines for big arrests, dramatic car chases, and drug busts that kept the media captivated. But the truth was that many of his big cases were fabrications. Jenkins and his squad had learned how to manipulate the system perfectly by playing both sides of the law. They would rob drug dealers, resell the stolen drugs, and file false reports to make themselves look like heroes. It began small. A few $100s skimmed from a raid here, a few unreported weapons there. But greed doesn't stay small for long. Soon, Jenkins and his men were stealing thousands of dollars from suspects, sometimes even from innocent citizens. They broke into homes without warrants, planted evidence when their stories didn't add up, and lied in court with the confidence of men who believed they could never be caught. For years they were right. The department valued results, arrests, seizures, statistics, more than honesty. Jenkins delivered results. He brought in high numbers, got praise from superiors, and even received commendations. Behind the scenes, his squad moved like a pack of predators, watching, following, and deciding who would be their next victim. Some of the men under Jenkins later described the operation like a business. They had rules. When they robbed a drug dealer, they would split the money evenly. Jenkins took the largest share, of course, but everyone got something. They even had a code. Don't get greedy and don't get caught. They used police-issued GPS trackers to follow suspects, staged fake traffic stops to seize cash, and carried toy guns in case they needed to plant them on someone after a shooting. But every empire built on lies eventually collapses. In 2017, FBI agents investigating a separate drug case stumbled across something odd, a dealer who claimed he'd been robbed, not by rivals, but by police. At first it sounded like paranoia. Then other victims told similar stories. Money missing after arrests, jewelry taken, drugs reappearing in evidence reports that hadn't existed before. The pattern led straight to the Gun Trace Task Force. The FBI began secretly recording the officers. What they captured sounded surreal. Jenkins and his men discussed robberies like business deals. They joked about stealing overtime pay, fabricating reports, and how easy it was to fool their supervisors. In one recording, Jenkins bragged that the bosses don't care as long as we bring in guns. It was the perfect encapsulation of a culture that valued appearance over truth. When the arrests came, they were swift and public. The images of handcuffed officers, still in uniform, being led from precincts shocked the entire city. Jenkins and 6 other officers were charged with racketeering, robbery, and falsifying records. The indictment read more like the description of a crime syndicate than a police unit. The trial revealed an ugly reality. The Gun Trace Task Force had been operating this way for years, right under the noses of their superiors. One officer testified that Jenkins once kept a trash bag full of stolen money in his attic. Another admitted they regularly used department vehicles to transport stolen drugs. Jenkins himself, when confronted with overwhelming evidence, finally pleaded guilty, but not before trying to justify his actions as part of the job. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Several of his officers received similar terms, but the damage extended far beyond those prison walls. Nearly 300 criminal cases linked to the Gun Trace Task Force were thrown out. People who had spent years in prison were suddenly released. The city of Baltimore paid tens of millions in settlements, and yet the greatest loss wasn't financial, it was moral. For the people of Baltimore, who had lived through decades of tension with the police, the scandal confirmed their worst fears. The same men who claimed to fight crime had been committing it all along. In neighborhoods where trust was already fragile, the revelation destroyed what little remained. Mothers told their children to never look a cop in the eye. Business owners refused to cooperate with investigations. Calls to the police dropped dramatically. The city's leadership promised reform, new oversight boards, and stronger accountability. But inside the department, many officers admitted privately that Jenkins's crew wasn't unique. They were just the ones who got caught. The culture of produce results at any cost had rewarded corner-cutting for years. The gun trace task force simply took it to its logical extreme. Even now, the story echoes in every discussion of police reform. Baltimore's streets are quieter in some ways, but the silence feels different, heavier, suspicious. The police cars still patrol, but they pass through neighborhoods where windows no longer open when sirens sound. Wayne Jenkins once called himself the man who made Baltimore safer. But when the truth came out, the city realized that safety built on lies is no safety at all. His downfall wasn't just the collapse of a corrupt unit. It was the revelation that in Baltimore, for too long, the badge had become both shield and weapon, and the people were left wondering which one they would face next. In the desert heat of Arizona, a small county sheriff built an empire on fear and fame. His name was Joe Arpaio, known across the nation as America's toughest sheriff. For more than 2 decades, he ruled Maricopa County with an iron fist, turning law enforcement into a spectacle and himself into a political brand. But behind the cameras, the chain gangs, and the media stunts, a much darker story was unfolding, one of abuse, racial profiling, and systemic corruption that would eventually bring his empire crashing down. Arpaio's career began with good intentions, or so he claimed. When he took office in 1993, he promised to clean up the streets, reduce crime, and make criminals fear the badge again. His methods were brutal and unapologetic. He forced inmates to live in open-air tents under the scorching sun, made them wear pink underwear as humiliation, and boasted about feeding them spoiled food to cut costs. To his supporters, he was a hero who didn't care about political correctness. To his critics, he was a tyrant who used cruelty as performance. But beneath the theatrics, something much more sinister was happening. Arpaio's department became a machine for discrimination and power. Deputies were encouraged to target anyone who looked illegal, which in Maricopa County often meant Latino residents, U.S. citizens included. Traffic stops became fishing expeditions for immigration status. Homes were raided without warrants. Entire communities lived in fear of their own law enforcement. As his popularity grew, so did his arrogance. He surrounded himself with loyalists who didn't question his orders. Internal complaints disappeared. Deputies who resisted his policies were reassigned or fired. Arpaio cultivated an image of invincibility, the sheriff who couldn't be touched. But in 2011, the U.S. Department of Justice released a damning report accusing his office of systematic racial profiling, unconstitutional detentions, and widespread civil rights violations. It was one of the most severe findings ever issued against a local law enforcement agency. Arpaio didn't back down. He called the investigation a witch hunt, accused the federal government of political bias, and doubled down on his tactics. His defiance turned into open rebellion when a federal court ordered him to stop detaining people based solely on immigration suspicion. He ignored the order. Deputies continued the sweeps. He appeared on television, proudly declaring that, "No judge tells me how to protect my county." That arrogance became his undoing. In 2016, a federal judge found Arpaio in contempt of court for willfully violating the order. He faced possible jail time, an unthinkable fall for a man who had built his entire identity on jailing others. His conviction the following year made headlines around the world. But before he could serve a day behind bars, then President Donald Trump pardoned him, calling him a great American patriot. The pardon didn't erase his guilt. It only amplified the division he had created. Even after his legal troubles, the full scope of Arpaio's corruption continued to unfold. Investigations revealed misuse of county funds, retaliation against political opponents, and a culture of fear inside his department. Journalists who reported on him were targeted with bogus subpoenas. County officials who questioned his spending faced harassment. Arpaio had turned an entire sheriff's office into his personal kingdom, one that operated by his own rules and answered to no one. When his reign finally ended, it left deep scars on the community. The Latino population of Maricopa County, nearly one-third of its residents, had lived under a reign of terror disguised as law enforcement. Families were separated. Children grew up watching their parents handcuffed during traffic stops for nothing more than looking foreign. Trust between the community and the police evaporated completely. Even many officers later admitted that the department had lost its way. Some described being ordered to prioritize immigration raids over violent crime investigations. Others recalled how resources were diverted to keep Arpaio's media image alive. Press conferences, camera crews, and staged arrests, designed to make the sheriff look unstoppable. Behind the showmanship, real policing was neglected, and real criminals thrived in the chaos. Years later, Maricopa County is still paying the price. Taxpayers have funded tens of millions in legal settlements for Arpaio's misconduct. The sheriff's department has undergone sweeping reforms, but the memory of that era lingers. The pink underwear and tent jails became national symbols, not of toughness but of humiliation and corruption. When asked after his conviction whether he regretted anything, Arpaio simply said, "I did my job." To him, the suffering, the fear, and the ruined lives were collateral damage in a war he thought he was winning. To those who lived through it, it was a war against their very existence. In the end, Joe Arpaio's name became a cautionary tale. Proof that when a badge becomes a brand, justice becomes theater. Power without accountability doesn't protect communities. It destroys them. And in Maricopa County, where the desert sun once beat down on inmates sleeping in tents, the echoes of that destruction still hang in the heat. A reminder that the toughest sheriff in America was also one of its most dangerous. In the quiet town of Biscayne Park, Florida, crime was supposed to be under control. The population was barely 3,000, the streets lined with palm trees and pastel houses, the kind of place that tourists drove through without a second thought. But beneath the sunshine and silence, a small police department was faking its entire image, and its chief was leading the deception. Raimundo Atesiano became the chief of the Biscayne Park Police Department in 2013, a man who promised to make the town safer, cleaner, and more disciplined. He told the village council he'd reduce crime to zero, and within months, it seemed like he was succeeding. Arrest rates skyrocketed. Burglary and theft cases were being solved at record speed. On paper, Biscayne Park looked like one of the safest towns in America. But it was all a lie built on the backs of innocent men. Atesiano's department wasn't solving crimes. They were fabricating them. To make their statistics look good, officers were instructed to arrest random black men from the neighborhood and pin unsolved crimes on them. These men had nothing to do with the burglaries, the vandalism, or the car thefts they were accused of. Their only crime was fitting the description that made the department's numbers shine. Former officers later testified that Atesiano gave them explicit orders. "If you see someone black walking through the neighborhood at night, stop them," he told them. "Find something, make it stick." The officers were pressured to create the illusion of efficiency. Fake clearance rates, falsified reports, and coerced confessions. They'd close cases by blaming the same few men for multiple crimes, sometimes charging them for offenses that hadn't even been reported yet. For a while it worked. The department boasted a near-perfect clearance rate, unheard of for any city, let alone one that small. Local officials praised Atesiano as a model police chief. Residents slept a little easier. No one asked why every suspect in the department's records was black. No one looked too closely at the details. But lies have a way of unraveling. In 2014, a defense attorney began noticing something strange while reviewing old arrest files. Several men charged with different burglaries had identical confessions, right down to the wording. It didn't make sense. When one of those men, a local maintenance worker, was finally acquitted, he told his lawyer he had confessed under pressure, after hours of being threatened, mocked, and told that resisting would make it worse. The pattern caught the attention of state investigators, and soon the FBI got involved. They reviewed years of cases, comparing fingerprints, evidence logs, and statements. It became obvious that many of the supposed confessions were written by the same hand, sometimes even before the suspect was brought in. The officers had been cutting and pasting stories to fill quotas. In 2018, the truth finally came out. Raimundo Atesiano and several of his officers were indicted on federal charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights. In court, prosecutors revealed the scope of the scheme. At least 3 innocent men had been falsely arrested and convicted to make the department's statistics look perfect. One of them had spent over a year in jail for a crime he didn't commit. During the trial, one of the officers broke down and admitted that they had been ordered to make arrests regardless of evidence. "We were told to pin cases on black people to make the numbers look good," he said. His testimony shattered what little defense Atesiano had left. The former chief tried to argue that he hadn't given explicit orders, only encouraged good police work. But the paper trail told another story. Signatures, memos, and internal emails showing that the manipulation came from the top. In 2019, Atesiano was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The officers who followed his orders received lighter sentences after cooperating with investigators. During sentencing, the judge told Atesiano, "You didn't just violate the law, you violated the public trust in the most personal way possible." The aftermath was devastating for Biscayne Park. The town that once boasted of being crime-free now had a reputation for corruption. People who had once waved to officers from their driveways now crossed the street when patrol cars drove by. The innocent men who had been framed struggled to rebuild their lives. Their records cleared, but their memories scarred. What made the case so chilling wasn't just the corruption, it was how small it was. This wasn't a sprawling metropolis or a massive police department. It was a handful of officers in a sleepy Florida town, willing to destroy lives for better statistics and a pat on the back. It showed how easily justice could be twisted when reputation mattered more than truth. Years later, residents still talk about it in whispers. The town has new leadership, new policies, and mandatory body cameras. But some of the old fear remains. Every siren sounds a little different now. Less like safety, more like a reminder of betrayal. Raimundo Atesiano's name has disappeared from the town's official history, but his legacy lives on in the people who will never again believe that a badge automatically means honesty. His story stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how corruption doesn't always come with money or violence. Sometimes it comes disguised as ambition, wrapped in the language of progress, and it thrives quietly until the truth can no longer stay buried. In 2015, the residents of Baltimore were already restless. The city had been tense for years. A long, uneasy relationship between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to protect. But when Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old man, died in police custody that April, the spark finally met the powder. The city exploded into protest, anger, and grief. Amid that chaos, something darker came to light, not just a single death, but a whole department rotten from within. The Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force was supposed to be the city's elite crime-fighting unit. Their mission sounded noble: get illegal guns off the streets. But instead, they became predators, robbing citizens, planting evidence, dealing drugs, and framing people for crimes they didn't commit. The men in charge of cleaning up Baltimore were, in truth, its biggest criminals. It started with small signs, whispers within the department. Officers who flaunted their money despite modest salaries, seized cash that never made it into the evidence room, arrests that didn't quite add up. But those whispers were ignored because the unit delivered results. They brought in guns. They made big busts. They made the city look safer on paper. And in a department desperate for good news, no one wanted to question the heroes. Sergeant Wayne Jenkins led the crew, charismatic, bold, and untouchable. He told his men they were the wolves and everyone else were sheep. They roamed the city in unmarked cars, chasing anyone who looked suspicious. When they found drugs or money, they often kept a portion for themselves. Sometimes they broke into homes under the guise of searches. Other times they pulled over random drivers, stole whatever cash they found, and wrote false reports to cover it up. The corruption ran deep. Jenkins and his team would sometimes carry toy guns to plant on suspects if a raid went wrong. They'd use illegal GPS trackers to follow people they intended to rob. They even sold the drugs they seized back onto the streets. It wasn't policing. It was organized crime wearing a badge. One of the most chilling moments came in 2016. Jenkins and his team robbed a man of $200,000 in cash during a supposed traffic stop. They split the money, doctored the paperwork, and celebrated. But unknown to them, federal agents had already started investigating. They were following a paper trail of missing funds, suspicious overtime pay, and complaints that kept getting buried. When the FBI finally moved in, they hit the unit hard. One by one, members of the task force were arrested. The investigation revealed not just theft, but years of systemic abuse, false arrests, and manipulated evidence. Some officers confessed to robbing people during raids, pocketing thousands, then lying under oath to cover their tracks. In total, 8 officers were indicted. The trials exposed how deep the rot had gone. Officers admitted to fabricating reports, lying in court, and using illegal tactics to pad their numbers. Jenkins, once the department's star sergeant, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Others received lesser sentences for cooperating. But the damage couldn't be undone. Dozens of convictions tied to the corrupt task force were overturned. Men who had spent years in prison walked free, their lives shattered by crimes they hadn't committed. The city paid out millions in settlements, and the phrase gun trace task force became synonymous with betrayal. For Baltimore, the case wasn't just about a few dirty cops. It was about trust, the kind that takes generations to build and only moments to destroy. It proved that corruption didn't always come from outside forces. Sometimes it came from within, hidden behind commendations and medals. Years later, documentaries, books, and podcasts would revisit the scandal. The stories from victims still haunt the city, people who were robbed, humiliated, or framed by those who swore to protect them. For many Baltimore residents, every patrol car that passes is a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. The department has since promised reform, new leadership, stricter oversight, body cameras, and federal monitoring. But the scars run deep. Ask anyone who lived through those years and they'll tell you, it wasn't just the crime that hurt. It was the betrayal. Because the men who carried the guns and wore the badges weren't just law enforcement. They were supposed to be the last line of defense between chaos and order. And when they turned that power inward, when they began to treat citizens as prey, the very foundation of justice cracked. The Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force remains one of the most damning examples of police corruption in modern American history. A group that started with a mission to make their city safer instead became its greatest threat. And long after the trials ended, the question still echoes. If the protectors become the predators, who's left to trust? Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more true stories that expose the dark side of power, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive, where we uncover more real crimes that shattered the line between law and corruption.